Welcome back to the Docker with .NET section of the Getting Started with Docker course. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the Docker file that Microsoft builds for our .NET Core projects. Let's come over here to Visual Studio. We're right back in the Docker file, and let's close these other ones out. Let's talk through this line by line, because we've gone through all these different commands already, so we understand what each of them does in theory. Let's talk about the practice of it. So let's start off right away with the from. And this is where we get our first image. And we get it from mcr.microsoft.com/.net/core/ASP.NET. That's the image. Then we have the colon, which indicates this is now the tag. And the tag is 2.2-stretch-slim. So that's Microsoft's tag for it. Now, if we come over to the Docker hub, so if we go to hub.docker.com and look for ASP.NET Core, we can do a search there. We can find the different run times that they provide. So we can scroll down here and find there's a bunch of them. Okay, and so we can see that there's a stretch slim for the ARM, and there's a lot of different options here. So the question might come up, well, how do they pick that one? Well, they kind of know their product. They know what they're looking for in their list. So which one you choose, it's kind of up to you, whichever one you find works best for you. But in .NET, the nice thing is they provide for you the one they recommend. In this case, for .NET Core 2.2 projects, they recommend 2.2-stretch-slim for building your applications. For running your applications. Okay, so this is for actually running your application. This one down here, notice the next from one down here, they have an SDK version, which is 2.2-stretch. So that's the SDK versus a stretch slim, which is not. So an SDK is shorthand for software development kit, and that's for actually building .NET Core projects. So they have two different versions in here. So let's talk about the first one first. This one, which they call as base, I mean they're naming this image that they're building right here as the base image. They use the stretch slim, which is a small, thin layer that they use to actually host a .NET Core application. So it doesn't have any of the build tools, doesn't have anything extraneous. Its job is just to host a .NET Core application. So that's step one. Then they say, well, on top of this base, we want to say that the working directory for base is /app. Remember that working directory will create the directory if it doesn't already exist. So now we know that this base will have a folder called app. And then it says, I'm going to expose two ports, 80 and 443. Remember, this is just more of an announcement rather than an activity. So it's not actually doing anything to the container. It's more saying the container will have these ports. So port 80 and port 443 internally that we then can expose. So that's the base image. But then it immediately does another from statement. And this from is the SDK, that's software development kit. And it's also 2.2, but it's called build. So they've named it appropriately because you understand what build means. It means this is a build image. Now they also create a working directory. This one's called source, SRC. So in this SRC folder, we're going to put our files. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky, and we'll talk through what Microsoft is doing. They copy the CS proj file. okay, which seems pretty straightforward. They're copying just a CS proj into the basic Docker folder. But here's the tricky bit. Right now, it's saying copy from the basic Docker folder. Inside there, you should find a CS proj file. But look where Docker file lives. It lives in the same location as a CS proj file. If I were to find this in File Explorer, let's do that, and we'll bring up here. Notice that the Docker file and the CS proj file live in the same folder. So this copy command doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense because there's not a subfolder called basic Docker. That's the folder we're in currently. And the reason why it's a little weird is because when they actually make the call to build this image, they say, yeah, I know that the Docker file is in this folder, but we're actually going to go one level higher. So I'll show you what we mean there. Let's open that folder back up. Even though the Docker file is here, where it's saying the root of this application or this process is up here. Now, as a Docker ignore file, which we haven't gotten into yet, essentially a Docker ignore file says, don't copy these files over. Okay, when you do a copy, ignore these files. But right now, it's saying that the Docker file is here, even though it's one layer deeper. And the reason for that is because in the .NET world, we have a concept of a solution and projects. And so it doesn't know if there's one project or multiple. So it wants to go at the solution level so that it can bring in all the different projects if it needs to. Now, the reason why it does this is because what happens if you're on Windows and you're running a Linux Docker setup, then whenever you do any of these copies and builds, what and part of that is to support the ability to attach the debugger so we could debug our applications even though they're running inside a container. So all to say, there'll be some complexities here that you won't have in yours, but we can learn from these things. Okay, so they're doing a copy of just the CS proj file over to the basic Docker folder. And the reason they do just the file is because they want to do a .NET restore. So we're doing a .NET restore. That's a run command, by the way. Now remember that this is going to create a layer, and this is going to create a layer. Then this will create a layer, then this creates a layer. So there's multiple layers being created in this build image. So the run command will say run, which remember runs on the shell, or in this case, it's going to run it. It's going to run the shell, and the reason we know that is because there's no square brackets, so we know it's not running an executable. So the first thing that gets run is .NET, and it passes in these parameters: restore, and then the name of our CS proj file. what that will do is it will restore any NuGet packages that we need. Next, we're going to do a copy. And it's going to copy all the files from our directory, which remember is the solution level. So it's going to copy everything from the solution and all the projects over to dot, which is that source folder. Then it's going to set the working directory to source/basic docker, which is the folder that our project is in. And then it's going to do a .NET build, which is a run command, and pass in the parameters build is one of the parameters, but then basic docker.csproj and -c in release mode and -o, which is the output. And the output goes to the /app folder. So it's going to build our project, and it's going to output the result of the build to the app folder. So now we have a built application, and it is located, the results are located in the /app folder. So now we're done with the build container. The build container now has a source directory, which has all of our source code, and it has an app directory, which has the compiled version of our website. Now, we're going to say from build. So instead of saying from an image, that has been created for us, we're actually saying, hey, build on top of the build image, and let's call this thing publish. So now we're going to say run .NET publish, that same csproj file, release, and outputting that to the /app folder. So we've done a build to that folder and now a publish to that folder. Now once all that's done, we're done with this container, and we can kind of pause and say, okay, we've done the build, we've done the publish. Now let's say from base. Well, base is way back up here. Remember, that's the stretch slim version. That's not the SDK. It doesn't have any ability to do any of the compiling that you would need to build a project. It just has the ability to run projects. So it says start from the base, so from base, and call it final. So from base as final, set the working directory to /app, which we already have created, and then copy, but copy not from our local machine, but instead that -- from, and the location is the publish container. So we're going to copy from the publish container, and we're going to copy from /app, which /app is where we outputted the publish of our .NET publish of our csproj file. So copy those files from the publish container to the final container and copy them to the dot location, which, by the way, is the working directory /app. So now we have a slim version of the .NET Core 2.2 container that has a /app folder, actually like here, the /app folder that has the built version of our project. So now, one last command is entry point. Remember what entry point does? It says, and there's two ways of doing it. We have the square brackets or no square brackets. So in this case, we have square brackets. So it's not going to run it from the command line. It's going to run a command directly. And the command to run directly is .NET. That's the command, and here are the parameters. format. It just has the final published source code. So now we've got a container we can pass around, we can deploy to Azure, or whatever we want to do with this container. Now let's run this using the Docker command. And it's going to take a couple seconds. But once we do, we should get our page come up, and we do. So there's our running container. So let's close this back out. But it's still running. Let's go over to our container tools and also go to containers. Notice it's still running, and there's our port. Let's go to files. In this case, let's look at open up app. Notice there's our files. I actually copied over all of them, which is kind of disappointing because some of them shouldn't be over there. And we'll take care of that in a future video. But in theory, this is where theory breaks down sometimes. I think what happened is because we're doing debug, it might not actually clean it out, but it's supposed to, and you should clean it out. So you only have your basic docker.dll to actually execute. Okay, so there's our files. We can browse through that and see that in fact we have a whole bunch of files in here we could play with and run, and that's our container. Okay, so with that, let's look at the output and let's look at what it has done. So if we scroll up here, we're verifying that it's working. And they've cluttered up as quite a bit, but there are commands in here we can pull out. And then we set the working directory, we expose the ports, and then we set the label, and then we set another label, and then from there we have the first step of our process built. So let's look at now that notepad. Let's expand this out and look at what the Docker build command is. Notice it's actually like 3 lines. And that's a lot of stuff. And this is why sometimes when you start looking at Docker, you go, cool, I got it. You know, we do the hello world, we do a simple web server, and life seems simple. And then you go to .NET and you say, okay, let's create a web project, and it creates a Docker file, and it kind of reads pretty clear. And so then you say, okay, let's drop into the command line and just do our own build. And it doesn't work. And why doesn't it work? Well, let's look at these files and kind of understand what they're doing. So we have a -f here. This is where it sets the path to the Docker file, and then it's going to change that path to be this right here, which is the solution directory. So here's a Docker file in the project directory, but then it sets a solution directory up as the directory to start from. And then we have it naming the Docker image to basic docker :dev. That's cool. Setting the target to be base, setting the label to be that com.microsoft.created by equals Visual Studio. Say another label that is the basic Docker. So those labels are things that it's doing to label our images. So that's the build process. So the tricky bits are the setting the path to the Docker file, and then setting the path to the root directory we want to start from. Besides that, it's pretty common stuff. And we'll go over more of the command line stuff in the future. Let's look at the run command. This is even more complicated. And actually, that line doesn't have to be with it. So you have a Docker run, which it disconnects, and it does a -v, and it sets up remote debugger for read and write. And then it does another -v, and it sets up this to be /app. And there's just a whole bunch of stuff in here. So user secrets. And we have some roaming HTTPS stuff. And we have NuGet packages. We have a NuGet package feed. There's a fallback. We have fallback packages and NuGet fallback folder and file watcher and ASP.NET Core environment variables and other more fallback stuff. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in here. Okay, and the reason why there's a lot of stuff in here is because of how it sets up the build process. So it sets the build process up to link in, for example, NuGet, so that it can bring those packages in. And then it sets up so that we have connections. Let's see, where's one? Well, here's the user secrets. So if you have user secrets on your machine, then it brings those in as well, so that in case you have things in there that you don't have in your app settings.json file, it wants to make sure it has those. This is magic, don't look behind the curtain. I get that. However, with that being said, when you're first starting out in Docker and you're doing .NET stuff, it is quite okay to say, I understand this Docker file in general, and I understand that when I hit run, it's going to build a container, and I can look at my containers and see, oh, there's still a running container, and I can delete that, or I can even drop in a PowerShell and stop the container, so I could pop in here and do my Docker ps-a, and I understand what's going on there. I can do Docker images and see my images, and all this stuff you can do, and yet you can't do everything that Microsoft is doing, and that's okay. Is it frustrating that Microsoft has a very, very complex system set up? Absolutely. I wish there was a I want to debug stuff mode and I want this Docker container to be ready for a normal build mode, because I think it'd be much less complex and it would be much cleaner and easier to use even from the command line if we did have those two alternate versions. We don't. Now you can build your own, and that's cool. Or you can say, you know what, I'm going to do the easy mode and let Microsoft do it when I am doing .NET Core, and it'll be okay. It's up to you which way you want to go with this, okay? But I wanted to walk you through that so you understand what's going on in the Docker file. I find it fascinating, some of the stuff that's going on and how they're doing it. It shows, this neat flow of, creating a base image and creating a build image and moving things through to build and publish, and then moving to our final image and actually creating this published version. So there's a lot to learn here and a lot to help stretch and grow you as you understand it. And I've walked you through quite a bit of it, but it's always neat to kind of take a peek under the covers and see what's going on, see how it works, see what they're thinking through, because even these commands here, you can take these commands and run them yourself on your command line and see how they work. So you drop it into the command line in our project folder and run the .NET build and then run the .NET publish. Just set a different path since we're not in Linux. But otherwise, these should work just fine. And you'll see how it works and make it even figure out, what did they do not wrong, but why is it sending all those files there? How can we clean it up to just be the publish? And I think the issue right here is the build goes into /app and so does the publish. And I think that what we'd want to have actually is just the publish. So stuff like that we can tweak and play with, but now you at least have a better understanding of how Microsoft is working with Docker to create this environment that we can play around in. Okay? Now I'm going to do some cleanup here. So I'm going to stop my container. And once it stops, I'll also delete it. And as far as images go, I have the option to delete it or not. I'll probably leave the images on my machine, at least the generic Microsoft image. So let's go back to the PowerShell and we'll do our Docker images. We have basic Docker, which we're not going to use anymore. So let's do a Docker remove image, and it's 407 as its tag, its image ID. And now it's gone, so we do a clear screen, Docker images, and it's just that stretch slim from Microsoft that's still there. And just to be sure, let's go to Docker ps-a, and there are no containers. So we cleaned up now after our little demo here. And I'll give you a source code just to play around with, and you can try different things. Maybe even try making your own image or Docker file based upon changing some of these things. So we don't need to go to the solution level. So maybe just take this out and take this out, and just start going through this and building it out the way it should, you think it should, and seeing how far you can get. Okay, so play around a little bit and just kind of get your hands dirty in how to play with this, because you have something that works now. Now you can mess with it and see if it still works later. Now, our next lesson, we're going to talk about what if you already have a .NET Core project and you want to add Docker support later. So we'll cover that in the next lesson. Come on back for that one.